We all know that money drives politics, but you might be surprised to learn about the amount of dark money pushing policy behind the scenes. See, dark money is made up of funds obfuscated through different shell organizations, making it extremely difficult to trace. And perhaps no one's mastered this tactic more than billionaire brothers Charles and David Koch. The Kochs are well known for putting the money behind some of the worst legislation on the books. And recently, some light was shed on the players behind the Kochs themselves after a confidential donor list was left behind at a posh hotel in Palm Springs. So to discuss what was in that document, as well as the role of dirty money behind the scenes from elections to vulture funds, I'm joined now by investigative journalist Greg Palast, who's coming out with a new movie called Vultures and Vote Rustlers. Thanks so much for coming on, Greg. Always a pleasure.
Glad to be with you, Abby.
So, Greg, let's talk about this Koch brothers document that was recently left behind at the donor event. What was the most damning takeaway from its exposure?
Well, it's the list of the secret landlords of our planet. These are the private funders. The Kochs are not exactly short of change. David and Charles are each worth about $22 billion. And let's not forget brother Billy worth, I don't know, about $5 billion himself. What we have here is a list of the other billionaires that they're coordinating with, who are basically funding an entire right-wing political machine. Now, in the good old days when America was a democracy, we got to know who was putting money behind candidates, who was putting money behind referenda, legislation, lobbying. Them days are gone. What's happening right now is that we have something called social welfare organizations, which since Citizens United and another court decision called Speech Now, we don't know who these guys are unless someone leaves a sheet of the names of the billionaires secretly pooling their money with the Kochs in a photocopy machine. Thanks a lot, Brad Friedman and others who've passed this list on to me.
Amazing. Greg, and every time I cover the Koch brothers on this show, people write me asking when I'm going to expose George Soros. I mean, is there anyone on the left that's doing as much political damage as the Kochs are on the right?
Well, the problem is that the left is not really responding. That is, for example, the DeVos family, which was as part of the funding that's pooling their money with the Koch brothers, their Amway products. They put $44 million into Michigan politics. This is the center of the U.S. auto industry, the center of American unionism, and yet they just passed a horrendous right-to-work, what's called a right-to-work law. Basically, it prohibits contracts between unions and businesses, which say that if you're part of the union contract, you have to be part of the union. Where was the other side? So you have millions and millions coming from all over the country, pouring in to basically slice up and destroy union power. And yet there was no one on the other side, not even the Obama administration, for example, which, you know, in the auto bailout, they used right-wing Republican Harry Wilson as the negotiator who works with these billionaires. They used Bruce Ratner, an infamous investment banker. Excuse me, not Bruce Ratner, excuse me, Steve Ratner, Stevie the Rat. And, you know, they did not defend unions at all in the auto bailout. In fact, they let 35,000 auto parts jobs go to China. And they beat up the unions something fierce. So you don't have another side. There's only one side here. That's the problem. It's not like there's no money on the other side, but you don't see Obama actually defending the rights of the workers. That makes the Koch brothers out on the field with their other billionaire buddies playing against no team at all. I mean,
right.
It's worse than the Seahawks and Broncos.
You know, that's a very good point. You don't see the systematic assault from really any left-wing billionaires, I guess you could say. And you just mentioned the DeVos family. Mother Jones just wrote a great expose saying, are they the next Koch brothers? I mean, it seems like, is it ever going to end? I mean, these billionaire families that are just assaulting workers everywhere, dismantling unions. Greg, let's move on to your book, Vulture's Picnic. I just heard about something really interesting called vulture funds that you cover in the book. What are these, and can you give us an example of how they're applied in the developing world?
Well, for BBC television and The Guardian, I went undercover and found that there was a group of billionaires, and one of them, by the way, who's the real Goldfinger, who makes the movie Goldfinger look like a Girl Scout. What they do is that through bribery, intimidation, they seize what were considered paid-off debts of poor nations, Liberia, Congo, nations that have been in civil war. And they then use tactics which involve, again, bribery or intimidation to force these nations to pay them something like 100, 200 times what they paid for these bonds. What it does is it takes poor and destitute countries and completely bankrupts them. In the case of the Congo, for example, we found out that that there was a group of vultures, vulture investors. They call themselves vultures. Like they're the number one guy, Paul the Vulture Singer. I didn't make up the term vulture. They like being called vultures. They want you to be afraid of them, and they're pretty scary. They grabbed $90 million from the Congo, or tried to, in money that was meant to end a cholera epidemic. I was at the cholera center in the Congo, and the Doctors Without Borders is running out of medicine. And I traced the lack of money back to a bribe paid to the Prime Minister of Bosnia. This is how these guys operate. It's not exactly they're just not guys who are collecting old debts. They're guys who are squeezing the poorest nations on the planet and playing fast and loose with the political system, not only in these nations, but in our nation. Other nations have outlawed, after I ran a report in Britain on vulture funds, their operations, their tactics were outlawed throughout the Commonwealth, but not in the United States of America. They have protection at the highest levels, believe me.
Well, I guess you could say what the World Bank and IMF does is pretty much the same thing with their structural adjustment policies. How are the vulture funds different?
Believe it or not, the IMF and the World Bank don't like these guys because they actually bust up the deals that the IMF and the World Bank come up with. So, for example, we've had massive debt forgiveness for nations like the Congo and Liberia. All that's done is allow these vultures to come in and seize the assets that are there. For example, in the case of the Congo, they were trying to ship cobalt to Europe, and this was seized. It's almost like somewhat legal piracy. These guys are really scary. They take the resources of these nations. Again, I want to emphasize, they don't do it just by buying up, their technical means is that they buy up old bonds that are long forgotten by these nations, that were issued before or during a civil war or a famine or some terrible event in which they pick up debt that's worth, on paper, is billions of dollars. They pick it up literally sometimes for a penny on the dollar, and then they don't demand just full payment. They demand several 100% payment. But it's enough to destroy these nations. They stop them. They basically take the aid we are trying to give these nations, that the U.S. taxpayers, European taxpayers, are trying to give poor nations, and they literally seize this money. And that's why they're very different even than the IMF. The IMF is a sweetheart, is a Valentine compared to the vulture and compared to Goldfinger and his gang. But the important thing is that they're influencing our government. For example, the #1 vulture investor, Paul the Vulture Singer, is also the guy who brought in the Koch brothers, all three Koch brothers, to back Chris Christie's attempted run for president. They're in a little trouble. Their idea of putting Chris Christie in the White House got a little jammed up on the George Washington Bridge. But understand that Singer, that the vulture funds they are putting in massive amount of money to protect their vulture operations by taking our White House, by building a vulture nest in the White House.
It's all connected, Greg. You work harder than most people I know. Thank you for staying on top of all of this. You have a new movie coming out. Everyone check it out. Thanks so much for coming on.